Am I on? Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's wonderful to see everybody. I'm on two screens. If I look away, it's because I am shifting to a computer that doesn't have a camera, but it's got my presentation up. So I may be wagging my head back and forth, but I've been paging through on the phone, and it's a delight to see everybody. Doris, I'm especially happy to see you. I haven't laid eyes on you in ages. So thanks everybody for turning up today. I have known Nicole ever since I guess I was a sophomore in high school at Noble and Greenough, and she was on the French faculty, and so I've had 50 years of acquaintance with Nicole, and about now coming up 30 years at the church. We joined the UU movement in 1991 in Arlington when we lived in East Arlington. And but my adult life has been basically Cambridge, Arlington, Belmont, and now back in Cambridge. So we're nearby. Sorry not to be in person for this, but I'm thrilled to have taken on this role of First Church historian. And I've had a fascinating few months sort of diving in and getting up to my elbows in the archives. I've had a couple of great meetings with Jim Lanfried for the handoff of a lot of this information and our rich traditions. And while Jim's knowledge of the church and its history is incomparable, I want to talk about some opportunities to build out our understanding of our history. And a key perspective that I wanted to share with you all right at the outset is I view understanding history for our church as not just a focus on the past, but how can we, by better understanding our past, our origins, the periods of growth, the periods of shrinkage, the crises that we've entered and the crises that we've weathered, how can we become a stronger church for the future? And I think there are a lot of lessons to be gleaned from understanding our past. So that's the basic orientation that I hope to bring to this over the next several years as we work in a few areas that I'll be addressing. Nicole, shall I jump in, or is there any other?
No, go ahead, please.
Okay. I thought what would be a good way to run this, I've got about 30 pages of slides, a lot of graphics. When I talked with Nicole, she suggested show a lot of pictures. So I've been through the archives and put together a lot of imagery that'll show you what we have in a few different areas. What I'd like to do is go for a few slides looking at my screen, and then we can take a break and maybe see if there are questions, comments, and then go back into the presentation. So if that makes sense, I'll just jump in right now, okay? So I think what I do now, I want to go to full screen. Okay. So, okay, I'll just go right ahead. We are going to take a peek into our church archives. The main way that I hope to move this project forward is convert a lot of what we have to digital format so that it can be more readily shared. And so since June or so, which is when Jim and I met to talk about this, I've been spending a lot of time with a flatbed scanner looking at some materials. Here's how I plan to conduct the discussion. First of all, tell you a little bit about our history committee. This is a new initiative of the Adult Programs Committee. We first convened in, I think, January or February of last year. And the idea was to bring together those who have a deep interest in our history to sort of peel into different areas and then look at some specific programs that we can conduct. We've already had a couple of sessions. I prepared a presentation 2 months ago talking about what I view as a critical period of transition in the church from the 40s to the 60s, and really a time I think of as the awakening of the church's social conscience. Then more recently, last month, we talked about a specific episode in the church that I think is of special interest to many of us. And that was when our minister, Gil Phillips, in the mid-1960s, addressed a sermon to the presence of the John Birch Society in the building across the street from us. It was a notable moment that got a lot of local and even some national attention in the media. And I think, again, was another important marker in the evolution of our church. This coming month, we hope in early March to have a panel discussion about the expanding role of women in leadership at the church, which really began in the 1970s. And although women have had vital roles in the church going right back to the very beginning, women didn't even become members of the church until the 1880s. And it's very interesting as we go through the archives to look about the evolving role that women played, becoming officers on the board, growing presence on the board. And but in terms of leadership, it was really the arrival of Marjorie Sams, Diane Miller in the 1980s, and of course, we had the pleasure of Alpha Radford leading our music ministry for more than half a century at First Church. So that's what we'll be talking about in March. I am hoping to organize a discussion about the church's various social action initiatives in the month of April. We have some material in the archives, but I think that's a great opportunity to build out our understanding of our past. And then in May, when the weather turns nice, I look forward to leading a walk and a kind of guided tour at the Mount Auburn Cemetery, where a large number of our church's early founders, founding generation and succeeding generation, have their final resting place. So that's what's going on at the History Committee right now. We've started with about a dozen folks, several of whom are with us today. Others are joining along and attending the sessions. But that's kind of the first bullet I wanted to cover. I'm going to be talking about many dimensions of our church. I think church means different things to different people, or a lot of things to many of us. I'm going to identify some of the early histories that have been produced, culminating in Jim Lanfried's really masterful history at the Sesquicentennial 150th anniversary. Our church is a place. It's been our physical home through time. Our church is a people that is led by ministers and also led by lay leaders. We've also had important members in our parish who have played prominent roles in the larger society. Our church really is a community, and I'll be sharing a few views of how we have played a vital role in the local community in the course of this presentation. And I've talked a little bit about the plans for the future, but let me just jump forward. So here are a few different ways we can think of our church. It is a physical place, and I'll talk about the evolution of the physical campus at 404 Concord Avenue. Our church is a people, vital community of several hundred. I imagine we're now 250 to 300 households, maybe more, probably closer to 700 or 800 people that have an identification with First Church. Our church is a pulpit where we've indeed have had some very prominent and influential ministers preach from our pulpit over the 100 and now 60, closing in on 170 years. It's a place of worship. It's a place that's a part of a larger tradition. And I think, although we are self-governing, we are part of the larger Unitarian Universalist tradition with roots in both camps, Unitarianism and Universalism. We'll talk a little bit about that. And as I said, we're a very active community with a lot of different kinds of things going on. So our church's first history was told in at the 50th anniversary, and all of these are available through links in I think it was a couple of months ago, I put out a newsletter, and we can circulate it. But if you're interested in finding the first history that was written, it was a sermon given on the 50th anniversary of the church's founding in 1906 by our minister, George Hale Reed, seen here standing on what were the first steps of the church. Look at that wonderful ivy-covered entrance. It was a lovely, very picturesque entrance, but not terribly practical. So that's where the porch is right now. So that's an interesting document. And then Henry Wilder Foote, who was a very prominent minister in the denomination. He came to us from a position on the faculty at Harvard Divinity School, gave a 75th anniversary sermon that he built out into a little booklet that you can read on the website, Remember the Days of Old. It contains some pictures of our early buildings, and again recounts that history. So that's something that you may have an interest in. Probably one of the biggest celebrations in the history of our church took place in 1956 on the church's Centennial. And the parish clerk, Amos Taylor, had been in that position for something like 35 years. He faithfully took notes at every parish committee meeting, and he assembled them into a dozen binders, those big brown leather binders that you can see in the history cabinet in the conference room, and subsequently added a couple more volumes. I'm spending a lot of time with those books these days. So there's Amos up in the top picture. And it's what I found especially interesting as I went through the volume that commemorates the Centennial is the picture in the bottom where you see what our congregation looked like in 1956. And I think we were on the cusp of some significant change. Belmont was a thriving community at mid-century. It had been in the 20s and 30s one of the most rapidly growing towns in the whole United States. The town went through a significant evolution and has continued to change. I think of us, and I mentioned this in the talk a couple of months ago, we were a religious liberal congregation in a politically conservative town. And I look at this picture and I kind of wonder what it must have been like to be there. You can see it was pretty lily white. Not that our complexion has changed that much in the ensuing period, but I do think that demographically we've seen a bit of a shift over the last several decades. Now we carry forward to 1990. This was the centennial of our building, the second physical home of the first church. And Smoke Twitchell prepared a wonderful booklet that I think if you have a look through it, you'll see a history of the building, wonderful pictures of our early ministers, discussion about the very active programs, the fact that we were bursting at the seams. And I think there was an implicit message in Smoke's booklet, and that was we were a burgeoning community that was exceeding our physical space. And I think that this booklet and that celebration really helped to set the stage for the very important project we undertook in the early 2000s, the replacement of our parish hall. So this is a key booklet. Again, you can have a look at it through one of the links in the history newsletter. Let me get page down. Okay, here we are. And I know I see ML on the screen. So ML, here's you and Jim from one of the mid 90s, or I guess early 2000s directories. Jim did us the service of preparing what is, and I'm sure will remain, the most comprehensive history of our church. He prepared it in chapters and assembled it into this 40-page booklet at the time of our 150th celebration in 2006. So this is really the best first place to look to get a complete sense of how we've grown over time. So I guess that's kind of an overview of the various histories. I wonder if, Mark, is everybody on mute? You can turn off the mute and see if anybody has any questions or comments about these various histories.
All right, people are welcome to unmute themselves. I can't unmute.
John, could you send somehow the URL to get hold of the history the way you said, so we can have access since you put everything on the URL?
Yeah, certainly. I can prepare a note that will assemble all of these things, and I can get that around in the next day or so.
Thank you.
Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the early days of Belmont. I'm sure you are all familiar with the fact that Belmont wasn't its own town. We were really carved out of the three adjoining towns, Watertown, Waltham, and West Cambridge, what became known later as Arlington. These are just a few items in the archive. Winslow Homer's drawing in the upper right, taken probably from a perch near where the Wellington School is. And you can see the steeple on the right. This is one of the only surviving images that depicts our church. There's the photograph in the bottom. I think I've seen one other photograph that was taken from the vicinity of the town hall, which is where the Wellington family had a homestead and a tavern for a long time. And there's a photograph in one of the history books about Belmont that shows our steeple off in the distance. Otherwise, I haven't seen any pictures of what the interior of this building looked like. It's been described as rather spare and simple. But this was our home from 1857 until 1890. Perhaps a little less well known is the fact that for the first year or so after we were organized, we actually met upstairs in the rooms upstairs from the general store. The general store was located, I'm not sure if my arrow, oh yeah, you can see my cursor is going to the upper left. So picture yourself looking down at across from Leonard Street. The Tudor block there is where the bank building is, and the Belmont Municipal Light Building, or the old light plant, was previously the site of the general store. And the church actually met upstairs in that building for the first year or so before our church was open. We were guided by Reverend Amos Smith, who is depicted in the lower left. And you see the list of names of our founding members, charter members of the church. And the story has been told that we needed to have a church in order to form a town. That wasn't, strictly speaking, a legal necessity in 1857 the Congregational Church had been disestablished in, I believe, 1833 or so. Doris would probably know the answer to that. But there was kind of a snide attitude at the legislature. How can you folks expect to form your own town? You don't even have a church. So the early founders of Belmont have been described as fighters. It took them about 5 years to get the town established. And the foundation of the church was really a pivotal step in making the case that Belmont deserved to have its own local government. So that was our home for about 3 decades. And it was in 1890 that actually in the late 80s, the decision was made we needed a new home. It was actually not larger. Our sanctuary is evidently a bit smaller than the old sanctuary of the other church that was on the site of the post office. But it was considered really one of the most beautiful sanctuaries in Greater Boston at the time it was completed. And here from the archive is the order of service on the left, when we were led by Reverend Hilary Bygrave. I thought the item on the right, listing how the pews were rented out, is especially interesting. It shows who the families were. It shows where they sat. This was the method of funding the church for several decades. You actually paid a rental rate. I think that's still the case in some religious traditions. But I thought of a fascinating item from the archive. Belmont was a different place in those days. I thought I'd share with you a few views from around town. We know the town hall, obviously, in the upper left. That scene hasn't changed too much. The upper right picture is of Godin Street. And look at that lovely canopy of trees. That looks like quite an elegant street. It is still a very elegant street. But that's an item in the archive. And to me, the most charming image is the one in the lower left. That's probably familiar to many people, looking along Pleasant Street or Route 60. It's now typically clogged with cars, but it was a very picturesque town in those days. The railway station in the lower right was constructed about the same time as the church. And I just thought that was a beautiful, beautiful image to sort of give the flavor of what the town was like. Now, across the street at 404 Concord Avenue, this is what the church looked like in the early 20th century. I've included a picture of our doorway, and look at those icicles hanging down like the sword of Damocles. I mentioned with the picture of George Hale Reed. Hang on for just a second. I'm sorry, we have an open floor plan here, so I was hearing noise upstairs. You can see why, even though it was a very picturesque entrance, we really needed to alter it in order to make the porch entrance that we have now. And then in the lower right, you see the Parish Hall building that was added in 1924. The church was really beginning to outgrow its space from the beginning, and there were several efforts to launch a campaign to build the parish hall starting right around 1915 or 16. But once the decision was made to go forward, that building project took only about a year, and this became our home for a lot of our social activities, religious education for about 80 years. And many of us on the call, I know, lived in that building. That was the first place I ever came, was as a young parent. I remember coming to into the old parish hall to go to one of the annual rummage sales when we were outfitting our house for our young infant children. And I remember thinking, what a wonderful group of people, what a beautiful church building, but isn't this parish hall kind of dowdy? Well, sure enough, within a few years, we updated it, but that was our well-loved and well-worn home for many, many years. So the first church remained a fairly constant presence in town for most of the 20th century. I'm just showing a before and after view of the building before the porch addition and what it looked like afterwards. But really, I think if you were standing at this spot for most of 100 years, yes, the trees grew up, but you would not have seen that much physical change in the appearance of the church building. Now, on the inside, the story's a little bit different. And I talked about this a couple of months ago. I think these images showing the evolution of our sanctuary are quite interesting. When the church was initially constructed, we had a small, fairly simple organ in the, I guess that would be the southeast corner. That's where the choir sat. And to the left of the chancel, there was a door that entered into a minister's study. And so it was a somewhat different arrangement. In 1930, through a large gift from the Atkins family, we were endowed with this wonderful Cassavant Frere organ that completely filled the east end of the church and required taking over the minister's study. It's way oversized for a church of our intimate size, but it's a wonderful instrument. I love listening to it. And at some point, either in conjunction with the organ renovation or probably a few years later, I thought it was interesting that the chancel was redecorated and really took on much more the appearance of a, how can I describe it? A standard order Protestant Christian church with the cross and the altar, the lectern, the pulpit and the lectern. And I don't know when this was done. I don't know the exact year that it was undone, but I think the church had this appearance for about 10 or 20 years. I believe it was around the time of the ministry of Edwin Broom, who was an interesting character from our past. I spoke about him in this talk a couple of months ago. I think he was a relatively conservative, more theistically oriented minister. He had grown up in the Presbyterian Church, but became Unitarian as an adult, is my recollection. The cross was removed from our chancel, and the church was redecorated in the 50s. I know by the time of Reverend John Nichols Booth, the cross, I believe it was, or actually, again, this may have been in the late 50s, the cross was removed. We have a scene in the lower left that shows the annual Christmas pageant. This picture was taken probably about 1952 or so. And it's interesting to me, the church was painted that pale green at that point. And then I had the more broad scale, almost fisheye view. I actually assembled that panorama about 10 or 15 years ago before we left for the Chenery School, right before or no, I guess that's after the renovation, because you can see the doorway has been replaced up there by the choir. So this is just a few glimpses of pictures in the archives of how our inside has changed. Now, we hit a point in the 90s where we were bursting at the seams, and the decision was made. There's no way really to make fuller use of the existing building. It was on 9 levels. Really, in many ways, the arrangement was becoming impractical. And that's when we undertook to replace it with our wonderful new and much larger and much more rationally organized parish hall building that opened in 2004. And that picture, I believe that Jim Lanfried took that picture in the bottom of the screen, which I think is one of the loveliest images, with the old railway station in front of it. That's the octagonal building was the original Wellington Hill railway station from the mid-19th century. And we continue to improve the building. The solar project that you see on the roof of the building that I know was fondly in the hearts of Mark and Nancy Davis to install on the building when we first built it back in the early 2000s. We weren't able to get the project done then, but thanks to the Davises and to several other families in the church, we were able to install the solar panels that now take care of about a third of our energy needs. I think represent an important statement that we need to be prepared for what the future brings us and meet our energy needs in a more environmentally responsible way. So I'll take a pause there, and any questions or comments about the pictures about our physical campus? And if not, we can just go forward, and I have a couple of slides just to show you. This slide is 2 pages from the 1990 building Centennial, showing our settled ministers throughout this period of time. I have not included pictures of our transitional ministers, interim ministers, who have oftentimes played such an important role in the church. I think especially, I remember Doris's ministry very fondly. I remember John Nichols, who was with us during our last year here and at the Chenery School, very fondly. But these were the settled ministers throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries, right up to the time of the building Centennial. And one of the goals I have for the Archives Project and the History Project is to gather more biographical information about these people. Some of them are lost in the mists of time, and there's just not much information at all. In other cases, they're really quite well known. Henry Wilder Foote was very prominent in the denomination, as was John Nichols Booth, who was our minister at mid-century and who actually left quite a good and fulsome autobiography that I was able to find in the Dictionary of Unitarian History. But over time, I am hoping to assemble more biographical material, and also, where it exists, writings of these people. So, for instance, Charles Billings, who was our minister in the late teens, early 1920s, produced a very interesting history of the Christian church and how the Unitarian tradition grew out of the historic origins of Christianity back to the first century. And I know there are very interesting facts to be learned about the early lives of these men and women, what they did and how they led us while they were here in Belmont, and some of the interesting things they did after their time in Belmont. So I'm hoping to build out that record as we carry the history project forward. Following 1990, of course, the tradition continues. These are the settled ministers that many of us have known most intimately over the last 2 or 3 decades. And now the tradition continues with Chris Jablonski, who joined us 2 or 3 years ago. I think having no idea of the challenges he would face with leading us through the pandemic, but what a wonderful job he has done to keep us together during this extremely challenging time. I mentioned that we are not just a local church, a local community, a local people, but we are also part of a wider tradition. These are a few items that I've come across in the archives that I find especially interesting. I've often told the story that I, in many ways, became a convert to Unitarian Universalism just by picking up some of the tracts off the rack at the First Parish Church in Arlington. Our daughter was in the preschool there, the Sunshine Nursery School. And one day I just was waiting for a parent-teacher conference, picked up a few of these tracts, took them home. And when I looked at them a day or two later, I remember the moment when I called out Teresa and said, "Come here, you got to hear this. This is you." And a moment later, I said, "This is me." And I told people never underestimate the importance of the literature that we use to convey the message about our tradition. The document in the upper left, introducing Unitarianism, was written by John Nichols Booth, our settled minister in the early 1950s. I believe this is dated 1953. He subsequently revised it in 1981. After he left Belmont, he became the minister at the Second Church in Boston. What's now the physical building is the Ruggles Church at Audubon Circle. That was a Unitarian church in the late 50s, early 60s. That was his pulpit for a number of years. So he was a prominent voice in the denomination. And I think it's interesting to study documents like this to see how our self-understanding has evolved through time. In addition to writing that tract or booklet for the denomination at large, he also produced this document in the upper right, A Young Person's Guide to Unitarianism, that was really calibrated for the young people in the, they called it the Channing Club in our local parish. I'm showing the Jack Mendelson booklet. Many of you may perhaps have seen it. This one probably dates from the 80s. And then the one in the lower left is, from time to time, we continue to produce booklets like this. This was a simple fold over that describes what this church does in this local community. So this was really more messaging to prospective members right here in Belmont. But I think that materials like this are a critical part of the archive because, as I said, they help to explain to the wider world or to prospective members why we choose to be in community with each other. Now, one of the vital aspects of our church tradition, going right back to the late 19th century, is children's education, children's religious education. I'm including a few of the booklets that the RE program has produced through time. Some of the early ones that I came across go back to the 50s. I haven't found materials from much earlier than that, although you see in the upper part of the frame the Unitarian Sunday School Society Life Member Certificate for Sarah Wellington upon payment of $10. I believe she was a student, but I don't know if this would have been like a graduation or certificate or what, but that was an interesting item, just kind of a one-off. I didn't find any others related. The booklet in the bottom, 1961 to 62, I think gives a sense of just how well developed our children's RE program became in the 50s and 60s. It was regarded as one of the premier programs throughout the denomination, had teachers who were involved for sometimes several years in a row, large staff of volunteers. In some cases, in some years, the teachers were paid. The physical facilities were not so great. If you look at the picture in the upper left, this is one of the classes meeting in the old, the space that became Dawes Hall, basically just the rather shabby looking basement of our sanctuary building before it was renovated. So I think physically we're in much better shape now with our wonderful new classroom wing with 8 or 10 separate rooms for kids. And I've included in the lower right, this I just pulled off the website a few days ago. I think we will look back on this time as one of the most interesting in our church's history, that we managed to keep our community together and provide education despite our inability to be present with each other. This is from the virtual website. It includes many children's religious educational materials for use right now. Another aspect of our children's program, of course, for going back to the early 1980s, is the annual children's musical. We have dozens of records of musicals that Alpha led over the years, and that Ian Garvey continues to lead at the present time. So these posters all bring back a lot of happy memories for me, and I'm sure for many of you who have had children go through that program. We've always been a very musical church, not just in Alpha's era, although Alpha has been an extraordinary leader of the music program. But I thought I'd include this slide again. This is from that slide set from the early 1950s in the choir loft that shows what choir practice looked like back in the day. Look at that angelic set of young children's choristers in the lower left. So that's been a vital part of our tradition. I took the picture in the lower part of the frame from my perch. I sit right up back center in the choir loft when we're up there. And so I sometimes think I have the best seat in the house. But that I just put those together to give you a sense of the importance of choral music throughout our history. In the upper right, I've included an image of a hymn that was composed by the lyrics were composed by Kermit Morrissey, who was the president of what's now the New England School of Law and a prominent member of our congregation in the early mid-50s. And the music was composed by Robert Rhines. He was an attorney who was I'm not sure if this is Robert sitting at the organ. I think it might be, or it might be the man who followed him. But it's called Unity Eternal, or Belmontia. It was actually copyrighted and published and intended for broader use throughout the denomination. But as I read the lyrics, they don't show well in this slide, but it's in the material that I've prepared. I think the language in the hymn probably didn't wear well. It's a little bit gendered and sexist, but it's interesting to me that music was an important enough part of the program in the 50s that we would see fit to produce a hymn that actually earned a copyright and was intended for wider circulation throughout the denomination. Now, our musical tradition is not just choral music. It's also, we've had many organ concerts, chamber music concerts, the annual piano concerts that helped to raise money to maintain our instruments. And then, of course, the lively coffee house program. And I've shown a picture here on the bottom of one of my favorite memories from my years at First Church. This was one of the auctions where we had the Fab Four or the Fab Five here, dressed up as Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So that was probably from about 10 years ago, when we had the 60s themed auction. We have been a very socially active congregation for many decades. The list in the middle is from today's website, a list of the initiatives of the Social Action Committee, and they run the gamut. They include many areas of focus. We have members today who are deeply committed to advancing the cause of social justice in all its dimensions. Some of the newspaper headlines that I've included are merely intended to be representative and not comprehensive. What I'm hoping to do in April is convene a discussion where we can build out our record of all the many ways in which our church has gotten involved, really rolled up our sleeves and been active, where we've provided witness, we've participated in protest, and really tried to advance the cause of social justice and advance the perspective of religious liberalism in the world. So this is just a little taste of some of the many areas in which we've been active. I mentioned earlier that it was really beginning in the 1970s that women assumed more of a role of leadership in the church. One of the things I've done is I've been assembling an archive of the membership directories, and some of them go back to the turn of the century or the 1920s. All through the 50s and 60s, the church secretary would maintain and update an annual record of official members. And what's interesting to me as I went through that process, it was right around 1970, between 71, 72, and probably no later than 73, 74, right in the early 70s, I noticed that women up until that point in time were listed as Mrs. John Doe. And it was only beginning in 1973 or 74 that they were listed as Mary Doe. And so that I thought was a very interesting transition and a marker of what was happening in the society at that time. This was, I remember seeing the Gloria Steinem show at the ART last year. Ms. Magazine, I think, came out right around 1972. So that's a bit to glean out of the archive. As I said, I mean, women were always prominent, always drivers of activities, fundraising, attendance. But in terms of leadership, I think that was the critical moment in time. It was the late 70s that we called Marjorie Sams, and we had this period of 15 or 16 consecutive years of leadership by women as settled ministers, something I'm sure will be coming again in our future. So again, just a hint of a much broader topic for us to address in a discussion session this coming month. An enduring presence throughout our history has been the Alliance itself. And I have been interested to come across a handful so far of these booklets that provide not only a listing of the members of the Alliance through time, but also the annual programs. And these, as I come across them, I'm digitizing them. And I think they provide a very interesting record of what this organization, who has comprised it in the past, and what the program and activities of the Alliance have been over time. I've also found, I haven't included them in this presentation, but wonderful material about the Centennial quilt, the gift of the Alliance in 1990. But the Alliance has been really central to the church throughout its history. I've just thought you might enjoy seeing some assembled pictures of some of the women who have been prominent in the group in recent decades. As a chorister, I certainly remember sitting up in the loft and looking down at the back of that array of white-haired women in the aisle that I know Elena, I think Vasco was the one who I became more acquainted with. I didn't know her sister. Was it Mildred? I was fascinated to find there's this news clip about Eleanor Whitty. I didn't know Eleanor, but I don't know quite why it happened, but her picture as a young woman was I came across in the archive, and I just thought it was very interesting to think of someone whose life spanned so many decades in the town of Belmont, and who maintained a connection with our community. A critical part of our archive are the records of the lives of people who have lived among us and who have been well loved by us. And of course, one of the vital functions that a church serves is to conduct people out of this life. And we have a collection, not comprehensive, but it's an interesting glimpse at the history of the people that have comprised this community over time. And again, I'm just providing examples of some of the memorial service programs from people who I've known all of these people actually in one way or another over the past few decades. And I hope that we can continue to build out this archive as people end their lives and leave us from our church here in Belmont. I think that these programs are a critical part of our archive and can help to tell the story of their lives and bring them to mind as we look at them. So I've digitized probably 40 or 50 of these programs. Maybe there are other people who have had memorial services at our church whose stories are not told in our archive, and we can add them and include them. And I think I'm close to finishing up. I added this last slide. I mentioned Wellington Brook. As I've gotten involved in this project over the last few months, I've really come to think of our church as a river of humanity. And I was thinking of the wonderful line that you can't step into the same river twice, because the second time the river, it's a new river and you're a new person. And indeed, our church, although it's been a constant in our community for more than 150 years now, it's a constantly changing organization. Every year, the composition of our church changes. New people come, old people leave us, but this river of humanity has been a constant in the community, changing though it has been. The church has played a vital role in Belmont really from its inception. And my hope, as I said at the outset, is that by better understanding our history and understanding some of the difficult periods we've been through, we can keep this a strong community of a strong, thriving, and active community. I'm reading a lot about some of the challenging periods that we've been through. We have been through downturns of membership. We've been through financial crises. We've been through sometimes disruptive periods of conflict, but we have always found a way back. And I think as we develop the story, tell the story of those crises, tell the story of how we came back from those crises, we can help to draw out lessons that, as I said, will help us to remain a strong, vibrant place, a center of worship, a center of community action, a beloved community. So that was all I had prepared, but that's the last slide. So I'm happy to kind of open it up for questions and conversation at this point.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful presentation. And it's kind of whetting our appetite for the next one, if you're willing.
Okay.
It's just fascinating, John, and you've really put it a wonderful way of you organizing it and presenting it in themes, and it's fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Nancy. I didn't realize you were here. It's great to see you.
It's one. I got up early just for
good.
you.
That's good. Thank you.
No, it was wonderful, fascinating. And you said some of this is on the website?
Not yet on the website, and this is something I want to. I'm surrounded by boxes. I've been bringing stuff home to run through the flatbed scanner, and I need to reorganize it. And what I'm hoping to do is organize material by decade and theme, and then have it in a safe, secure place. Right now it's in plastic cartons. We had last summer, I guess you weren't here in Belmont, Nancy, but during the latter stages, I guess it was June, July, the church has been closed, and the air conditioning system was turned up because of we weren't really using the building. Well, we had a humidity problem and a lot of mold developed, and we had to purge a lot of material out of the church, including furniture and so forth. Lorraine Dalton and I spent a good deal of time going through and cleaning up in the library and the history cabinet. I want to make sure that we have a physical environment that will be safe, secure, and environmentally protected, and then put the materials in a sensible physical order. But the digital archive will make it much easier to find stuff. It's scanning documents so that they are searchable is I mean, this is a long-term project. This is going to take a few years to get done, but after the work is done, I think it'll be much easier to research specific themes in our history. So it's an ongoing project.
John, it's Eloise. I have Frances Harris here. She was thrilled to see Bob Sontheimer, her beloved, up there.
Oh,
I
great.
love that collection of people that were a part of our group. That was really fascinating. Can you, at some point, tell us who Dawes is? We were trying to figure out who Dawes Hall is named for. Is that one of those white men?
You know, I will get that around. When I send out the material, I do have some information about the Dawes family, and I can't remember.
Okay, it's eventually.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi,
Thank you.
Francis.
It was great. It was really, really terrific. Wonderful
Oh,
to
great.
see.
All right. Well, it's great to see you. And I see Bob there on the couch with
Oh
you.
yes, we're all.
Great job.
We have you actually on our television, so that's why we were looking up.
Great, great.
Lanier had a question.
And I see Susan does too. I just want to make a bold-faced pitch for all of you to begin coming to the history group meetings. I don't know why it's not better attended, because it's things like this that we've been discussing. You can put in your calendar the first Thursdays of each month. John mentioned what's happening. I'm not making a pitch for next month because I'm one of the presenters for that, but for April and May, if you put the first Thursday in, and also I hope that either John or Lillian would send you the newsletter around. You mentioned it, but just send it to all the people in this group, because the links that John mentioned would take you to a lot of this material. And there's just a lot that John packed into that as well. So we've been having a great time with the history group, and you don't have to be a historian or particularly if you're just interested person, everybody's welcome.
Great.
John, my question was the perfect follow-up to Lanier's, because I can't come on Thursday evenings and am really regretting it. Are these recorded, and are they available to us?
I believe they are recorded. Mark, isn't the recording on right now?
So
Or
yeah, today's program is recorded. Most Alliance programs are recorded.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're.
Are the Thursday meetings recorded?
I do know that Sam Foster is sort of MCs the history meetings, and I do know he made a recording of both of the. So the first talk that I prepared 2 months ago was about this period, sort of 1940 to 1963, and the second was about the John Birch sermon, which was 1965. And I do know that both of those are available. I'm not sure exactly where, but a few years ago, I lived in the north of England and attended a Unitarian church in the city of York. And I was quite surprised a couple of weeks ago to get a note from a friend from York who said he'd been on the Belmont website and was interested to watch my presentation. So yeah, it's out there for the whole world to see. So I hope I don't say something stupid, but anyway.
John, I just checked the church's YouTube channel, and at least your talk from about the mid-century changes is up there.
Okay.
So I think Sam is posting them to the church's YouTube channel. So if you just go to YouTube and search on First Church in Belmont, you'll find them.
Great.
Thanks.
I have another question. I seem to remember that our the Friday night
Coffee house?
thank you very much, one of those moments, was one of the first in the area or something like that. Do you
It
know
was
what I'm
the first.
Yes.
The first by
Yes.
Jim Hall. And I think Jim Hall was one of the founders.
Yes.
It claims not to be the first coffee house, but the first all donation or whatever, all nonprofit.
Benefit.
Right.
Yes, first
First
complete
coffee house
benefit.
benefit, yes.
Yeah, right.
Well, can I make a pitch for next month's Alliance meeting? I would love for all of you to join. One of our members is the task. He's going to present his work in woodworking. He does all kinds of very artsy work that's extraordinary and unexpected most of the time. I think you'll have a good time. And it will be at 11 a.m., second Thursday of the month, as usual. Thank you.
And you can join it by using the same link you used today.
Oh, and then we're gonna have Jeannie O'Farrell making a presentation also on her trip in Africa the following month after the Tetsky.
Well, John, I want to thank you. This was really interesting. You've done a huge amount of work and
Well,
putting together all the pictures, and it's just great. So thank you so much.
well, thank you, Pat. I appreciate it. It's actually, it really is a labor of love. It's a fascinating topic. We do have I think we have an unusually historic church. The link to the foundation of the town. One thing I read is the night that the town was established, there was not a 21 gun salute. It was a 320 something gun salute, or they set off 320 odd gunshots or whatever. The reason being, at that point in the history of Massachusetts, there were something like 320 communities, and now there's 351. So we were toward the tail end of that distribution. So Belmont is a relatively new town. There have been some founded since there, but that was just you think of the link to the history of the town has been important, but also the link to the denomination. The fact, as Jim has mentioned, wearing his UUSC hat, the fact that the UUSC has deep roots in our congregation, the fact that we've had clergy who have been some of the real leaders in the denomination. One of the things that John Nichols Booth used to talk about in the mid 20th century, because of our close links and the physical proximity of so many leading universities, it was said at that time that there were probably a greater concentration of university faculty at our church than any other Unitarian church in the nation. So it's a very, we belong to a pretty special community, and it's a rich history that I'm sure we will be continuing to build on in the decades ahead.